What's behind the flood of leaks targeting Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth? I wrote about that this week, saying that we were watching a military coup unfold. The brass versus the Senate-confirmed civilian leader. Many weren't happy. They thought I was defending Hegseth. I'm here with my editor, Bill Arkin, to discuss. Bill, are you a Hegseth fan?
Look, Hegseth is a buffoon, and he's obviously not qualified to run the Pentagon. And he's an idiot. But he is the Senate-confirmed civilian leader of an organization, the military, that the Founding Fathers intended not to rule themselves, that they intended that the military be accountable to our elected representatives. And as much as we might hate Trump or hate Hegseth, I'm more concerned that we adhere to the principles of the Constitution, which means that you can't destroy the Constitution in order to defend it.
So we diverge a little bit here. When I look at this, my concern is not so much like the abstract question of the Constitution. It's more, you can't talk about Hegseth in isolation. The alternative to Hegseth's civilian control is the military brasses, are the 4 stars and lieutenant generals and admirals that have run foreign policy into the ground for my entire adult life. And so when I don't look at it in isolation, just Hegseth, who I also don't like, and I consider, okay, well, the alternative is these guys, that leads me down a very different path, that these guys that have screwed everything up for my entire life, as long as I can remember paying attention to foreign policy, that they're being empowered now.
So you don't have reverence. So you don't have reverence for either the brass or Hegseth. Who do you want to run the military?
Well, so long as we're going to have leadership, it might as well be the kind that is subject to some kind of democratic pressure, which is to say the guy that's chosen by the guy that's elected and confirmed by the Senate. That's the less worse option to me. You're right, of course, that that's what the Constitution says. The question is, why does it say that? Why was that so important to the founders?
Well, because nobody wants to have a military that rules by its own whim. They want to have a military that reflects the politics and the structure of the country. That's what was intended in having civilian control. There is another model, and the other model would be that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the head of the General Staff is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but the founders intentionally made the president the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and his representative is the Secretary of Defense. And in fact, the Secretary of Defense is in the chain of command. So there's no general that reports directly to the president. Every general and every admiral reports to the Secretary of Defense. That's the law. Look, I'm loving that Hegseth is being pilloried. Everything from his makeup booth to the signal leaks to the chaos in his front office. I'm loving it. It's a great circus. But I'm not loving that the news media seems to be content that somehow the Pentagon leakers and the generals who are stirring up this chaos are the ones who are defending the Constitution and defending the nation against Donald Trump, when I feel like there's a constitutional crisis right within that argument, because it's not for the generals and the admirals or the Pentagon bureaucracy to decide who's the Secretary of Defense, or for that matter, what our defense policies should be. That's what we elected a president to do. And as much as you hate Donald Trump, the reality is that you cannot say, I'm defending the country, I'm defending democracy, I'm defending the Constitution because Donald Trump is such a menace, while at the same time ignoring the Constitution in the process of doing so.
Yeah, when I see the people attacking us saying that we're pro-Trump or pro-Hegseth, whatever it is, they don't seem to understand how much power the senior brass has in terms of being able to shape the media narrative that's unfolding right now. I think that unless you've worked in the press, you don't know how to look at a story and clock it as, oh, that was obviously an authorized leak. So can you talk a little bit about the coverage that we're seeing and why you think this stuff is coming from the uniform military, the brass that we've been criticizing?
This isn't the first Secretary of Defense who has been disliked by the brass. This isn't the first time that the permanent bureaucracy, what Donald Trump calls the deep state, has decided that it's going to be the arbiter of the sanctity of national security. Right? This isn't the first time, and so Hegseth might not be good for the national security. I imagine he's not going to last very long, but I also at the same time feel like the military needs to look in the mirror and ask itself, is it playing the right role? And when it leaks to the press, which it does and is doing in spades right now, when the permanent bureaucracy comes out and starts leaking that there's chaos in the front office or whatever, I really want to ask myself, first of all, is that just the Washington story? And that second, is there something that Hegseth is actually doing regarding the military that we should be concerned about, that does in fact harm the United States and our national security? To me, that's the only question, not whether or not he has a makeup studio near his office.
Yeah, I look at some of these stories and I'd be lying if I said they're not funny. Is seeing this haggard guy going out in front of the camera and clearly not having slept and having to defend himself. I enjoy it as well. But what that distracts from is, yes, more substantive questions of what he's doing that do actually threaten the military. This was another response people had was, wait, you're suddenly against leakers? Ken, you're like the leak guy. Aren't you supposed to like them? I do like them. And I'm not against the media publishing them. It's the question of what is the motive behind why they're doing this? And I don't want to break any hearts, but I don't think it's to inform the public. It's to undermine this guy that they don't like. And when we interviewed people in the military, these same senior brass, and confronted them with this, they more or less agreed, right? They were like, yeah, that is what it is. And they even seemed to recognize the problem with it. People that we interviewed were like, yeah, it's not good that you have the uniform military doing this, and it does undermine the civilian leadership, but they're still more or less okay with it. Why is that?
Well, they're okay with it because they think they're defending America. They're okay with it because they think that they are doing the work of protecting our national security, and they might be. But unfortunately, what we're also watching at the same time is proof that the Secretary of Defense actually has very little power, and that it is the bureaucracy that is in charge. And I understand why Donald Trump thinks that there's a deep state that's working against him, because guess what? There is a deep state that's working against him. Now, I don't mean deep state in the sense of some conspiracy running the world. Deep state that very much is the protector of the Washington way of doing things. And so when Donald Trump comes into office and he doesn't do it the way that it's supposed to be done, and Washington freaks out because the procedures weren't followed properly or the paperwork wasn't filled out properly, I feel like they're missing the point. And the point is that Trump was elected by the American people, and it's up to the elected representatives, the fucking Congress who isn't doing anything right now, to actually take action. And what action can the bureaucracy take? I see it as a parable, Ken. It's if Bernie Sanders were president or AOC were president or some model liberal were president and they were seeking to disengage the United States from the gazillion wars that it's engaged in all over the planet, if they were seeking to slash the defense budget, if they were seeking to making the military more transparent, if they were seeking to make the military smaller, would we be happy that the military itself was leaking and agitating and passive aggressively and not so passive aggressively fighting against the elected representative that the people voted into power to do these things? We wouldn't be. And so why are we comfortable with it happening under Trump? I'm not saying that in the end, undermining Pete Hegseth from doing anything is a good thing. I think it probably is a good thing, but I also at the same time worry that the national security state has way too much power.
Yeah, it's a subtle story that you have to look at both of the players, and these generals that are whipping up these narratives in the background are so good at making themselves invisible and making people think that they don't even exist and that this stuff is just, the Times is just they're doing Woodward and Bernstein knocking on doors and just finding out what happened instead of having these things packaged and delivered to them with a bow on top, as we know is generally the case in national security reporting. So that's the kind of context that I think people could benefit from, that certainly the military brass benefits from people not knowing just how little organic reporting is behind a lot of the stories that we're seeing about this stuff and how deep rooted this problem is. We tried to go into this in the story, but there's been a significant shift over the past even just few years or so, where long-standing norms against having generals serve as the Secretary of Defense have been eroded to the point that when Trump in 2017 nominated for his first Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis,
retired Marine Corps 4-star General Jim Mattis.
Right. And the law says you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to either pick someone who's from the civilian world, because again, we need that civilian control, or in the event that someone does pick a general, there's got to be 7 years that elapse between the time that they retired from service to the time that they become Secretary of Defense. Now, unfortunately, that law, like so many laws, is rendered toothless by the fact that the president can just waive that requirement, which Trump did with Mattis. And then after that, when Joe Biden came into office, he did exactly the same thing in nominating retired Army 4-star General Lloyd Austin. And he also waived that cool-off period. So erosion of the concept of civilian control of the military has been happening in the background sort of quietly. It got some criticism, but it wasn't really a central issue. What was amazing about those two nominations by Trump and Biden, those were the first times that a former general had been nominated to Secretary of Defense since 1950. So this is not something that's just a feature of American life. This is a new thing that is happening now, and it's changing as we speak. And there's hardly any attention to this tendency that I'm describing. And I think in part it's rooted in the lack of just civic understanding of what I was describing before. That's why I was trying to draw out your explanation of why it matters that the Constitution says that. Because I think we can all remember these lessons in school, but you don't really know why it matters. And it matters because examples of governments where they don't have that civilian leadership, it doesn't end well very often.
The military gets what it wants, Ken. It gets a larger budget. The Trump administration can run around saying we need to restore something about the American military. I don't even know what that is. The Biden administration and the Obama administration, for that matter, all increased the defense budget all throughout their administrations. So now we're facing a $1 trillion defense budget to essentially have a military that is going to be marginally larger, but not really larger, because most of that money ends up going towards a new ballistic missile and a new bomber and a new capital good X and Y. And so, yes, maybe it's making the military stronger around the edges, but in reality, is it really changing the national security circumstances that the United States lives under? So right now we have an ongoing and an endless war in the Middle East. We have Israel still fighting in Gaza. We have the Ukraine war continuing, and we have China that is supposedly the number one threat to the United States. And it seems to me that the military, by virtue of it being in charge, seems to feel like it can handle all of those circumstances and contingencies. But what I see is the military in charge. which is to say that there's a regional commander in charge of the Middle East and he needs his war. And there's a regional commander in charge of Europe and he needs his war. And there's a regional commander in charge of Asia and he needs his war. And now there's a regional commander in charge of the southern border and he needs his war. And the question is whether we need any of that, or which war can we stop, or what can we do that reduces America's military adventures around the planet and not increases their military adventures.
Yeah, that's an important point. Can you elaborate a bit on the differences between the uniformed military, their set of interests, what they tend to want and what they're rewarded to want, versus civilian leadership, which is under a different set of incentives, which is political in nature, which is what the country wants?
It's hard for people to understand because the military itself is split into many different entities. So you have the perfumed princes, the political generals at the top in Washington, and their responsibility.
The guys that go on cable news and pontificate about things.
They know more like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the chiefs of the services and the political generals who have to deal with Congress every day, who have to deal with the military industrial complex, who have to deal with the White House. And their interest is in protecting the equities of the Pentagon. That's what their interest is. Now, on top of that, you have the field generals, the ones that are out there in charge of the big commands and the ones who are out there actually commanding military forces. And their interests are in securing their regions or their functions. And so it's not like they can decide, oh, the Middle East is more important than China or Europe is more important than Latin America. That's for the president to decide. That's why we have civilian control of the military. Unfortunately, because civilian control of the military is so compromised and has been so weak for decades, it essentially defers to the generals in terms of what are our priorities and what are our wars that we're going to be fighting. So even Donald Trump, as president in his first term, had to defer to the uniformed military on questions like Syria, where he wanted to withdraw troops, or Korea, where he wanted to reduce troops, or Europe, where he wanted the Europeans to shoulder more of the burden and spend more on their own defense. And in every case, because that was upsetting the norm, whatever that norm was, the uniformed military and the permanent bureaucracy agitated against Trump. Mattis ultimately resigned over the question of removing troops from Syria, and didn't perform his function to be the representative of the president. He actually served as his own person with his own interests. They fucking get all the money from our tax dollars. They fucking do whatever they want to do. And they're able to get rid of a Secretary of Defense who is not compliant or is not gung-ho for what they want. But if tomorrow some of the proposals of the Trump administration were actually achieved, let's just mention one. Do we really need two regional commands in charge of the Western Hemisphere? I mean, that a Southcom is responsible for everything south of Mexico and a Northcom is responsible for everything north of Mexico? Like, what war are we going to fight in the future in Latin America? What war are we going to fight? Why do we need a combatant command in charge of Latin America? So that could be one command. But if the Trump administration actually did the sensible thing and said, okay, we're just going to have a Western Hemispheric command, it's responsible for the defense of the Western Hemisphere, not only would that be a good move, but they would freak out. The generals and the admirals and the Pentagon bureaucracy would protect the fact that there are more general officers with two commands, that there's more spending with two commands, that there's more independence with two commands, that they are protecting us in case Brazil invades the United States. And it's like they would freak out. So we never see any significant reduction in defense spending. We never see really an end to our wars all around the globe. because the military ultimately decides. I don't want a world in which the military ultimately decides. I want a world in which our civilian leaders decide, because someday in my life, when a liberal president comes in that actually has some cojones, is going to be able to implement his policies. I want strict adherence to the Constitution, and I want the military and the bureaucracy to be taking the president's orders and implementing them, not working to undermine them.
Yeah, you listed several examples here, like the withdrawal from Syria, but it feels like withdrawals in general, the uniformed military doesn't want to do. I remember it was like they were kicking and screaming when Biden wanted to leave Afghanistan, which was something that seemed overwhelmingly popular at the time. Is that just something that they always have, that they don't want to end wars?
I think that you got to reverse the question. It's more that they see threats. So we're still fighting in Afghanistan. We're just not fighting with troops on the ground. We're fighting what the military is calling an over-the-horizon war. So it's not that the military doesn't want to do A, B, C, D, and E. It's that the military still sees a threat from Al-Qaeda or from ISIS-K in Afghanistan, that the military sees the threat of ISIS in Syria, that the military sees the threat of radical Islam in Africa, that the military sees the threat of drugs and an open border, that the military sees the threat of Russia and sees the threat of China and sees the threat of Korea and sees the threat of Iran. And it's up to our civilian leaders to say, okay, I see that you see all of those threats, but what are our priorities going to be? Where do we want to put our money? How do we want to shape the world? And I could imagine some president coming in and saying, you know what? Having an Africa command and having the United States deployed in Africa from the tip of Somalia all the way over to Mali, it really isn't achieving anything. Terrorism is on the rise, but also at the same time, we see military coups happening left and right, and we don't particularly see a vibrant democracy emerging in Africa, and the economy is not particularly increasing. So is the military the right solution in Africa? That's the question that I would hope that a president of the United States would ask. And if the answer was, you know what, we're not really achieving our goals here, maybe we need to have a different approach, or maybe we need to have different goals. So what we've observed with Biden and Obama is that they think what I just said. And so they increase USAID, they increase diplomacy, they increase all of the other accoutrements of American soft power, but they never do anything about the military. And the result is that there then becomes a kind of rivalry between the military and the civilian agencies. And of course, the military spends its trillions and they spend their pennies. And so there's not really a power dynamic that's equal between those two. And because the president hasn't been capable of cutting back the military or pushing back the military, we fail. We fail because the liberal project to make Africa more democratic or to make Africa more prosperous or safer fails. And we fail because the military project goes on underneath that soft power project, and it actually doesn't achieve its goal of bringing security to the continent. That's basically what happens overall. That's basically what happens in every theater. There hasn't been a reduction of immigration into the United States because the military is deployed at the border and World War Z is happening and opposite to it. There's been a reduction in immigration to the United States because the whole of government is doing it. And so the role of the military is actually minor in this. But by having the military there, by saying it's a war, by saying that only the military can achieve the goal, then we end up with $1 trillion military and a military that essentially runs itself.
Yeah, I think an important point here is that going to the military and seeing what they think about something, it's not that they're trying to lie to you when they say, oh, we need more money, we need more of a military approach to this. It's kind of like asking a cop his opinion on something, and they're trained to enforce the law. So they're going to see law enforcement issues everywhere because that's what they do, just like a hammer wants to hit a nail. And so the military wants to use military force because that's what it has.
Yeah.
Is that the sense that you get talking to these generals and senior officers?
Yes, it is the sense I get. And also when they talk about Hegseth and his campaign, say, for instance, to instill a warrior ethos that somehow was lost, even though the US military has been fighting for the last 25 years in multiple wars. I don't know what more warrior ethos you would want to create. But when they look at it, they say, we don't really need a Secretary of Defense to be the rah-rah cheerleader of the military. We need a Secretary of Defense who tells us what our priorities are, who tells us what we should be focusing on. And so to them, that's what they feel they're missing, that they actually want that direction. They might disagree with it, and if they do disagree with it, then people should speak up or fall on their swords and resign. That's the option to the generals and admirals and to the bureaucracy. But the game that they play instead is, let's just undermine the Secretary of Defense and make it so impossible for him to implement anything that nothing changes. Well, if you're an American and you think nothing changing is a good strategy, then I don't know what planet you live on, because nothing changing means multiple wars around the world where the United States never seems to increase its level of security.
So I think we both have a lot of sympathy for the criticisms these senior officers have expressed to us privately, and which you're seeing play out in public reporting. That being the case, how do we proceed? How do you respond to those criticisms and the reality that Hegseth doesn't have the kind of executive function, the strategy, any kind of vision, as these same officers have expressed to you, all of which is real and a problem? How do you reconcile that with the problem, which was the point of our piece, which is you also need to have civilian control? We might not like the guy, but that's who the elected leader picked, and he's the civilian leader of the Pentagon now. How do you reconcile those two things?
This is a tough question, and it's a bigger question, and it's one that I'm struggling with myself. Because if you believe that Donald Trump is a threat to America, if you believe that he's a threat to democracy, if you believe that he's a threat to the Constitution, then certainly you want to do everything that you can to thwart him. And the challenges that are taking place in the courts, that's going to play out in the courts. Congress is seemingly doing very little or nothing these days, and so therefore we can't rely upon them to institute their checks and balances that are intended in the Constitution. But there's also a role to play by the American people, and that is that they themselves need to understand what their priorities are in dealing with this guy, both Trump and
Hegseth. And I
Hegseth.
think we're increasingly seeing engagement from the general public. We've written about one of the large hands-off protests that took place where I am in Madison, Wisconsin. That happened all over the country. Must have seen half a dozen demonstrations since then.
Yeah.
So I think that you talk to these demonstrators, you get a very strong sense that they also realize that Congress is out to lunch, and that I guess it's up to us to do anything. And that's a healthy response to all of this.
It's healthy, but it needs to be tangible. And so when you protest, Are you protesting that Pete Hegseth is the Secretary of Defense? Or are you protesting that state of affairs, one that has essentially existed since 9/11, that the bureaucracy gets to decide what our policies are? And like on a philosophical level, I would say that's why Donald Trump is president. Because people hate Washington and they hate the bureaucracy. And what are the two acronyms that you can mention that no one says go? And that's IRS and DMV. People just hate the bureaucracy. And that's a healthy thing, because that's also enshrined in our Constitution. So when Donald Trump gets elected, I think he gets elected because people hate the bureaucracy and hate Washington. So if I'm a liberal in America, I'm going to say to myself, well, we need to figure out a way in which government actually works so that demagogues like Trump aren't elected president, but also lifer Washingtonians like Joe Biden aren't elected president. I think that's why Obama was elected and so popular. And that's why people like Ross Perot and Michael Bloomberg become so attractive to the American electorate. And so I'm looking beyond tomorrow. I want to look at the country in the long term. Donald Trump was elected president twice because people hate Washington more than they hate Donald Trump. And I don't want us to live in a system in which that's always the answer, that it is a defender of the system versus an opponent of the system.
Yeah, Trump is a good cautionary tale for what can happen if you are against the status quo, as I am, and I think most Americans are, but you haven't thought much about it beyond that.
If there's anyone on the planet who is satisfied with the state of our national security, please speak up, because everyone has problems. Whether
How
it's
many four-star generals are there? Maybe a couple thousand? They seem like big things.
I don't think they're happy either. I don't
Privately,
think
you find them to be, well, you actually talk to these guys. You find them to be dissatisfied too, privately?
I think people feel like we're on a bit of a treadmill, a national security treadmill. And if they believe that if China is in fact the priority, then let's actually make it the priority. They believe that if the war in Ukraine is actually at a stalemate and going nowhere, then we should work to end it. They don't have confidence that Donald Trump has the ability to do that, but they do see that the treadmill isn't working. And I know we think of them as Marcus Welby grandpas up there on top, but the truth of the matter is that most generals today, I'm sorry to say, are like 15 years younger than I am. They're in their 50s. And their entire career has been the post 9/11 period. Their entire career. And so if we want to leave the post 9/11 period and adjust our strategic priorities to focus on actual big challenges in the future, then we need to leave these guys behind. So if all these generals and admirals who are being fired, maybe all for the wrong reason, are fired and younger blood takes their place, I'm not against it per se, but the younger blood has even more lived their entire careers in Iraq and Afghanistan.
We're seeing that in the Trump administration. He has Sebastian Gorka as senior counterterrorism director, and he has post 9/11 war and terror brain worse than maybe any official I've ever seen. And the same is the case with the FBI director, Kash Patel.
And that's why we can't let these fuckers run themselves. That's why we need to give clear orders to them as to what are the priorities. Because firing anyone is only going to bring up somebody behind them who is even more dipped in the same culture. And if you do what Trump is doing and bring in Hegseth and bring in Dan Kane, a retired 3-star National Guard officer, then all you're really doing is bringing in somebody who politically agrees with you, when in fact we should be having generals and admirals who are nonpartisan to the extent that one would never even be able to detect whether or not they were Democrat or Republican or agreed with Trump or disagreed with Trump. That in fact their oath to the Constitution was followed, which is that their allegiance is to the Constitution, not to the way of war, not to the ways of the Pentagon, not to the procedures of Washington, but to the Constitution, to protect and defend the United States. And we just don't have that. Because if you're a liberal, you want to get rid of all of the right-wing generals. And if you're a conservative, you want to get rid of all of the liberal generals or the left-wing generals. And so we then end up choosing the military to be partisan. We choose it to be partisan. And in the end, we can't have that system. It's not healthy for America.
Yeah, that's the irony of the Trump administration, is he correctly diagnoses this problem of that, wait a second, generals shouldn't be out here endorsing people. The founders warned against that. We even have laws to that effect, which we've written about. But then his response to this problem, which he's accurately diagnosed, is to then say, okay, well, I'll put in my own guys. And that'll be our solution to that. This set of generals is too partisan. Yeah. I'll stack it with my own partisans. Yeah, and that just exacerbates the entire problem.
Right. And you might say, I hate the history of the Pentagon, that Joe Academic from Harvard was the Secretary of Defense, followed by Joe Academic from Stanford was the Secretary of Defense, followed by Joe Academic from Cal State was the Secretary of Defense. You might say that's dangerous and awful because we don't want these academicians with their own ideas being the Secretary of Defense. We actually do want a business person. We want somebody who can run this frickin' establishment, and the president giving us what the strategic priorities are. You might say that that's a better system or a worse system. If you're a conservative, I'm guessing that you hate the fact of who most of the Secretary of Defenses have been in the post-war period. But a better choice is not to have a tattooed snake eater like Hegseth as the Secretary of Defense. A better choice is to have somebody who's actually capable of running this trillion-dollar industry, and somebody who actually has the managerial skills to be able to sort out the competing priorities of all of the commands in order to say, well, this is what's going to be the priority, and this is number 2, and this is number 3, and this is number 4. And I'm afraid a Fox News commentator and a former military officer who thinks his tattoos are more important than the country is not the right guy to do it.